The maintenance hangar at Fort Braxton echoed with the sound of boots on concrete and the mechanical whir of hydraulic lifts. Captain Sarah Mitchell stood barely 5 feet 2 inches tall, her regulation flight suit hanging loose on her compact frame as she conducted her pre-flight inspection of the H-64 Apache helicopter. Her small hands moved with practiced precision across the aircraft's exterior, checking every bolt, every panel, every weapon system with the methodical care of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Hey, short stack. The voice boomed across the hangar floor, followed by a chorus of snickers from a group of maintenance crew members. You sure you can reach the pedals in that thing? Sarah didn't look up from her inspection checklist. She had heard variations of this joke for the past 8 years of her military career, ever since she first walked into flight training at Fort Rucker. Her height had been a constant source of amusement for fellow pilots, ground crew, and commanding officers alike. At 5'2", she was technically within the minimum height requirements for Apache pilots, but just barely. Maybe we should get you a booster seat, called out another voice, this one belonging to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran who supervised the aircraft maintenance bay. Don't want you accidentally hitting the wrong button because you can't see over the instrument panel. The laughter that followed was neither malicious nor kind. It was the casual, everyday mockery that had become as much a part of Sarah's routine as her morning coffee and equipment checks. She had learned long ago that responding only made it worse, that the best strategy was to let her flying speak for itself. But after 8 years, the jokes hadn't stopped. If anything, they had become more creative. I heard they had to modify her seat just so she could see out the windscreen, whispered Private Johnson to his buddy, loud enough for Sarah to hear. Command probably spent more money on seat adjustments than they did on the helicopter itself. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she continued her inspection. She ran her hand along the Apache's 30mm M230 chain gun, checking the ammunition feed system. The weapon system was one of the most sophisticated pieces of military technology ever created, capable of firing 625 rounds per minute, with pinpoint accuracy. She knew every component, every specification, every tactical application. But the men around her, she was just the short pilot who needed help reaching the controls. The H-64 Apache was a formidable machine. $35 million of cutting-edge military engineering, designed to survive in the most hostile environments on Earth. Its twin General Electric T-700 engines could push the aircraft to speeds exceeding 180 miles per hour, while its advanced targeting system could track and engage multiple targets simultaneously. The helicopter's armor could withstand hits from 12.7mm rounds, and its sophisticated avionics suite made it one of the most feared weapons platforms in the world. Sarah knew all of this because she had graduated third in her class from the Army Aviation School, scored in the top 5% on every flight evaluation, and had logged over 2,000 flight hours in combat and training missions. She could navigate the Apache through conditions that would ground more experienced pilots, could thread the massive helicopter through spaces that seemed impossibly tight, and could place ordnance on targets with surgical precision, but none of that mattered to the men who saw only her size. Mitchell! The sharp voice of Colonel James Patterson cut through the hangar noise like a blade. Sarah snapped to attention as the base commander approached, his weathered face bearing the expression of a man who had seen too many wars and buried too many soldiers. Behind him walked Major David Harrison, the squadron's operations officer, and Lieutenant Colonel Sandra Price, the only other female pilot on the base. "Yes, sir," Sarah responded, her voice carrying the crisp authority that came from years of military training. Colonel Patterson stopped in front of her, his 6-foot frame towering over her compact form. He glanced at the Apache, then back at Sarah, his expression unreadable. "Mitchell, I need to discuss your flight status." The maintenance crew had fallen silent, sensing the gravity of the moment. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Flight status. Reviews were rarely good news, especially when they happened unexpectedly on the hangar floor. "Sir, my certifications are all current, and my last evaluation." "This isn't about your evaluations, Captain." Colonel Patterson's voice was measured. "Careful. I've received some concerns from the Flight Safety Board about pilot physical requirements. There's been discussion about whether certain accommodations might compromise operational effectiveness." Sarah's heart began to race. She had heard rumors about new regulations, whispers in the officers' club about height requirements being reconsidered. The military was always looking for ways to standardize operations, to eliminate variables that might affect mission success. A pilot who needed seat modifications, who couldn't reach certain controls without assistance, who looked more like a teenager than a combat aviator, she was exactly the kind of variable that bureaucrats love to eliminate. "With respect, sir," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest, "I've never had a flight safety incident. My mission completion rate is 97%, and my aircraft has never returned with battle damage that could have been prevented by pilot error." Major Harrison stepped forward, his expression sympathetic but firm. "Captain Mitchell, no one is questioning your skills as a pilot, but we have to consider the broader implications. What happens if you're shot down behind enemy lines? What happens if you need to perform emergency maintenance on the aircraft? What happens if you're injured and your co-pilot needs to evacuate you from the cockpit?" The questions hung in the air like accusations. Sarah had heard them all before, had answered them all before, but they never seemed to go away. Her height wasn't just a source of jokes, it was a constant professional liability that she had to overcome every single day. "Sir, I've completed all the same survival training as every other pilot in this squadron," Sarah replied. "I've passed every physical fitness test, every emergency evacuation drill, every combat readiness assessment. My size has never prevented me from completing a mission." Lieutenant Colonel Price, who had been silent during the exchange, finally spoke. "Sarah, the reality is that the Army is looking at pilot requirements across all platforms. The Apache is a complex aircraft, and Command wants to ensure that all pilots can operate it at maximum effectiveness without modifications or accommodations." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had known this day might come, had prepared for it, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. 8 years of training, 8 years of proving herself, 8 years of enduring jokes and doubts and constant scrutiny, all of it might be ending because she was 5 inches shorter than the men around her. "How long do I have?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Colonel Patterson's expression softened slightly. "The review board meets next week. Until then, you're grounded pending their decision." The words echoed through the hangar like a death sentence. Grounded. After 8 years of flying, after dedicating her entire adult life to military aviation, she was being pulled from the cockpit because of something she couldn't control, something that had never actually affected her performance. The maintenance crew was pretending not to listen, but Sarah could feel their eyes on her. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been joking about her height just minutes earlier, was now staring at his boots. Private Johnson was suddenly very interested in a wrench he was holding. The casual mockery had transformed into uncomfortable silence. Sarah saluted crisply. "Understood, sir." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I'll be in my quarters if you need me." As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of the Apache she had been inspecting. The massive helicopter sat silent and imposing, its weapon systems gleaming under the hangar lights. It was a machine, built for war, designed to dominate the battlefield, engineered to survive in the most hostile environments on Earth. And she was being told she wasn't qualified to fly it because she was too short. The walk across the hangar floor felt like the longest journey of her life. Every step echoed in the vast space, every sound amplified by the silence that had fallen over the work area. She could feel the eyes of the maintenance crew following her, could sense the mixture of awkwardness and sympathy that radiated from the men who had been joking about her just minutes before. As she reached the hangar doors, Sarah paused and looked back at the Apache one more time. The aircraft represented everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed to achieve. It was more than just a machine, it was her identity, her purpose, her reason for being. And tomorrow, it might all be taken away. The afternoon sun was harsh as Sarah emerged from the hangar, its brightness a stark contrast to the dim interior she had just left. Fort Braxton sprawled before her, a complex of buildings and training facilities that had been her home for the past 3 years. She had arrived here as a newly minted Apache pilot, eager to prove herself and contribute to the mission. Now she was walking away from the flight line, possibly for the last time. Her quarters were located in the officers' housing complex, a series of identical buildings that housed the base's pilot community. As she walked, she passed other aviators heading to and from their duties. Some nodded in recognition, others offered casual greetings, but Sarah barely acknowledged them. Her mind was consumed with the implications of what had just happened. The review board would consist of senior officers from the aviation branch, men who had never flown with her, never seen her in action, never witnessed her capabilities firsthand. They would look at her file, examine her physical specifications, and make a decision based on charts and regulations rather than performance and results. The fact that she had never failed a mission, never caused an accident, never demonstrated any inability to perform her duties, would be irrelevant compared to the simple mathematics of her height. Sarah's quarters were spartanly furnished, reflecting the practical nature of military life. A bed, a desk, a small television, and a closet filled with uniforms and flight gear. On the desk sat a photograph of her parents, taken at her graduation from flight school. They had been so proud that day, so excited to see their daughter achieve her dream of becoming a military pilot. Her father, a former Navy mechanic, had tears in his eyes as he watched her receive her wings. Her mother, a schoolteacher who had always encouraged Sarah to pursue her ambitions regardless of the obstacles, had been practically glowing with pride. What would she tell them now? How would she explain that all the training, all the dedication, all the sacrifice had been for nothing because she was too short to meet some arbitrary standard that had nothing to do with her actual ability to fly? Sarah sat on her bed and pulled out her laptop, opening her personnel file to review her service record. The numbers were impressive: 2,247 flight hours, 97% mission completion rate, 0 safety incidents, consistently high marks on all evaluations. She had flown combat missions in Afghanistan, participated in humanitarian relief operations in the Caribbean, and conducted training exercises across 3 continents. Her commanders had consistently rated her as one of the most skilled pilots in the squadron. But none of that would matter to the review board. They would focus on the modifications that had been made to her aircraft, the seat adjustments that allowed her to reach the controls comfortably, the minor alterations to the pedal positions that accommodated her shorter legs. Never mind that these modifications had cost less than $1,000 total, or that they had no impact on the aircraft's performance. Never mind that other pilots required similar accommodations for different reasons: glasses, back problems, previous injuries. Sarah's modifications were visible, measurable, and therefore problematic. She closed the laptop and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Outside, she could hear the distinctive sound of helicopters taking off and landing, the rhythmic thump of rotor blades that had been the soundtrack of her adult life. Each sound was a reminder of what she was about to lose, what she might never experience again. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. The caller ID showed Lieutenant Colonel Price's number. "Captain Mitchell speaking," Sarah answered. "Sarah, it's Sandra. I wanted to call and check on you. I know today's news was difficult to hear." Lieutenant Colonel Price was one of the few people on base who understood the unique challenges faced by female pilots. She had broken many of the same barriers that Sarah was now confronting, had endured many of the same jokes and doubts and constant scrutiny. But she was also 5 feet 8 inches tall, well within the normal range for military pilots. "I'm fine, ma'am," Sarah replied, though they both knew it wasn't true. "No, you're not. And you shouldn't be. What happened today was unfair, and I want you to know that I'm going to be speaking to the review board on your behalf." Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. "Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate that. Sarah, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about you. If they can ground you for being too short, what's next? Will they start grounding pilots for being too tall, too heavy, too young, too old? The military is supposed to evaluate people based on their performance, not their physical specifications." The words resonated with Sarah. She had always known that her career was about more than just her personal ambitions. Every flight she completed, every mission she succeeded in, every barrier she overcame was a step forward for other women who might follow in her footsteps. If she was grounded for something as arbitrary as her height, it would set a precedent that could affect countless future pilots. "What do you think I should do, ma'am?" Sarah asked. "Fight," Lieutenant Colonel Price replied without hesitation. "Don't let them make this decision in a conference room based on paperwork. Make them confront the reality of what they're doing. Make them explain why an exemplary pilot should be grounded for something that has never affected her performance." After the call ended, Sarah sat in her quarters contemplating her next move. She could accept the review board's decision quietly, request a transfer to a different position, and continue her military career in a non-flying capacity. It would be the safe choice, the path of least resistance. But it would also be giving up on everything she had worked for, everything she believed in. Or she could fight. She could challenge the decision, demand a hearing, force the military to justify their actions. It would be risky, potentially career-ending if she lost. But it would also be standing up for every pilot who had ever been judged by their appearance, rather than their abilities. As evening approached, Sarah made her decision. She would not go quietly. She would not accept being grounded without a fight. She would force the review board to confront the reality of what they were doing, to explain why height was more important than skill, why appearance was more relevant than performance. But first, she needed to prepare. She needed to gather evidence, compile data, and build a case that would be impossible to ignore. She needed to transform herself from a victim of bureaucratic prejudice into an advocate for merit-based evaluation. Sarah spent the evening reviewing her flight records, her evaluation reports, and her mission summaries. She compiled statistics on her performance compared to other pilots in the squadron, documented the minimal cost and impact of her aircraft modifications, and prepared a comprehensive defense of her capabilities. As she worked, she thought about all the times she had been underestimated, all the jokes she had endured, all the doubts she had overcome. Each challenge had made her stronger, more determined, more focused on proving that size didn't determine capability. Now she faced the ultimate test of that belief. The next morning, Sarah was awakened by the sound of helicopters preparing for their daily missions. The familiar noise, which had always been a source of comfort and excitement, now filled her with a sense of loss. She was supposed to be out there, strapped into her Apache, conducting training exercises or preparing for deployment. Instead, she was sitting in her quarters, effectively benched while bureaucrats decided her fate. She dressed in her dress uniform and made her way to the base administrative offices. If she was going to fight this decision, she needed to understand the exact nature of the charges against her, the specific regulations being cited, and the composition of the review board that would be making the decision. The administrative building was a maze of offices and conference rooms, filled with the mundane paperwork that kept the military functioning. Sarah found herself in the personnel office, speaking with a clerk who seemed genuinely sympathetic to her situation. "Captain Mitchell," the clerk said, reviewing her file, "I have to say, your record is impressive. I've never seen a pilot with such consistently high marks across all categories." "Thank you," Sarah replied. "Can you tell me more about the review board that will be evaluating my case?" The clerk consulted his computer screen. "The board consists of 5 senior officers from the aviation branch. Colonel Patterson will be presiding, along with 2 other base commanders from the region and 2 representatives from the Army Aviation Center." Sarah's heart sank. 5 senior officers, all of whom were likely to be conservative in their approach to pilot qualifications. None of them had flown with her. None of them had witnessed her capabilities firsthand. They would be making their decision based on regulations and policy rather than performance and results. "Is there an appeals process?" Sarah asked. "Yes, but it's rarely used. Most pilots who receive adverse decisions from the review board choose to accept alternative assignments rather than fight the decision." Sarah nodded, understanding the implication. Fighting the decision would mark her as a troublemaker, someone who challenged authority and questioned the system. Even if she won, it might damage her career prospects for years to come, but she had made her decision. She would not accept being grounded without a fight. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety. Sarah researched military regulations, studied precedent cases, and consulted with the base legal office about her rights and options. She discovered that there had been similar cases in the past, pilots who had been grounded for various physical characteristics, but most had accepted their fate without formal challenge. She also learned that the review board had the authority to not only ground her, but to recommend her discharge from the military entirely. The stakes were higher than she had initially realized. This wasn't just about her flying career, it was about her entire future in the Army. On Thursday afternoon, Sarah received official notification that the review board would convene on Friday morning. She would be given 30 minutes to present her case, after which the board would deliberate and render their decision. 30 minutes to justify 8 years of service, to explain why she deserved to continue flying, to convince 5 senior officers that height was less important than skill. That evening, Sarah sat in her quarters reviewing her presentation one final time. She had charts showing her performance compared to other pilots, documentation of her mission success rate, and testimony from commanders who had flown with her. She had photos of the minimal modifications made to her aircraft and cost analysis, showing their negligible impact on military budgets. But she also knew that facts and figures might not be enough. The review board would be looking for reasons to ground her, not reasons to keep her flying. They would be focused on risk mitigation, standardization, and compliance with regulations, rather than individual performance and capabilities. As she prepared for bed, Sarah looked out her window at the flight line. The Apache helicopters sat silent in the darkness, their imposing silhouettes barely visible against the night sky. Tomorrow she would learn whether she would ever fly one of them again. The sound of her alarm at 0500 hours seemed louder than usual, more urgent. Sarah rose and dressed carefully in her dress uniform, ensuring that every detail was perfect. She knew that appearances would matter to the review board, that they would be looking for any sign of nonconformity or unprofessionalism. As she walked to the administrative building, Sarah passed the flight line where the morning missions were being prepared. She could see her fellow pilots conducting their pre-flight inspections, the same routine she had performed thousands of times. Some of them nodded in her direction, offering silent support. Others avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with the situation. The review board convened in Conference Room A, a sterile environment with a long table surrounded by chairs. The 5 senior officers were already seated when Sarah arrived, their expressions serious and professional. Colonel Patterson occupied the center position, flanked by the other board members. "Captain Mitchell," Colonel Patterson began, "you are here today because questions have been raised about your physical qualifications to pilot the AH-64 Apache helicopter. This board will review your case and determine whether you meet the standards required for continued flight status." Sarah stood at attention. "Yes, sir, I understand. You will have 30 minutes to present your case, after which the board will deliberate. You may begin." Sarah had rehearsed this moment dozens of times, but standing before the 5 officers, she felt the weight of her entire career resting on the next half hour. She began with her service record, highlighting her achievements and performance metrics. She presented evidence of her capabilities, documentation of her success rate, and testimony from commanding officers. But as she spoke, she could see the expressions on the board members' faces. They were polite but skeptical, professional but distant. They were listening to her words, but not really hearing them. They had already made up their minds before she walked into the room. "Captain Mitchell," interrupted Colonel Richardson, one of the visiting board members, "while your performance record is commendable, the fact remains that you require modifications to your aircraft that other pilots do not. These modifications represent a deviation from standard operating procedures and could potentially compromise operational effectiveness." Sarah had anticipated this argument. "Sir, the modifications to my aircraft cost less than $800 total and have no impact on the helicopter's performance or capabilities. They are comparable to the vision correction equipment provided to pilots who wear glasses or the ergonomic adjustments made for pilots with back problems." "But those are medical accommodations," Colonel Richardson replied. "What you're requesting is a modification to accommodate a physical characteristic that may not meet military standards." The words stung because they highlighted the arbitrary nature of the standards being applied. A pilot who needed glasses could receive accommodation, but a pilot who was shorter than average could not. A pilot with a back injury could have their seat adjusted, but a pilot who was naturally compact could not. Sarah continued her presentation, but she could feel the momentum shifting against her. The board members were asking pointed questions about emergency procedures, combat effectiveness, and standardization requirements. They were building a case for grounding her, not looking for reasons to keep her flying. When her 30 minutes were up, Sarah was dismissed while the board deliberated. She waited in the hallway, pacing nervously as the minutes ticked by. Through the closed door, she could hear the murmur of voices, the sound of men deciding her fate. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 45 minutes, the door opened and she was called back inside. The board members had the same serious expressions, but now there was also a sense of finality in their demeanor. Colonel Patterson stood to deliver the verdict. "Captain Mitchell, after careful consideration of your case, this board has determined that the modifications required for you to effectively pilot the AH-64 Apache helicopter represent a deviation from standard operating procedures that could potentially compromise mission effectiveness. Therefore, we recommend that you be transferred to a non-flying position within the Army Aviation Branch." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. 8 years of training, 8 years of proving herself, 8 years of exceptional performance, all of it dismissed because she was 5 inches shorter than the men around her. "However," Colonel Patterson continued, "we want to emphasize that this decision is not a reflection of your skills as a pilot or your dedication to the military. You will be offered a position in flight operations where your experience and knowledge can continue to benefit the aviation community." Sarah stood at attention, her face betraying none of the devastation she felt inside. "Thank you, sir. When does this decision take effect?" "Immediately. You are hereby relieved of flight status pending transfer to your new assignment. As Sarah left the conference room, she felt numb. The hallway seemed longer than before, the walls closing in around her. She had fought her entire career to prove that size didn't matter, that skill and determination were more important than physical specifications. But in the end, none of it had mattered. She was being grounded not because she had failed, but because she was different. The news of her grounding spread quickly through the base. By the time Sarah returned to her quarters, she had received several calls from fellow pilots expressing their support and outrage. Lieutenant Colonel Price stopped by personally to offer her condolences and to assure Sarah that she would continue fighting the decision through official channels. But Sarah knew that the battle was over. The review board had made their decision, and challenging it would likely be futile. She would be transferred to a desk job where her flying skills would slowly atrophy and her dreams of aerial combat would fade into memory. As she sat in her quarters that evening, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had entered the military with dreams of serving her country, of proving that women could be just as effective as men in combat roles. She had endured years of training, overcome countless obstacles, and demonstrated her capabilities time and again. But none of it had been enough. In the end, she was being judged not by her performance, but by her appearance, not by her skills, but by her size. The system she had dedicated her life to serving had ultimately rejected her for reasons that had nothing to do with her ability to do the job. The sound of helicopters taking off for the evening patrol filled her quarters, a reminder of what she was losing. Each rotor beat was like a heartbeat, the rhythm of military aviation that had defined her adult life. Tomorrow, other pilots would be flying those missions, conducting those operations, living the life she had been denied. Sarah opened her laptop and began typing her letter of resignation. If the military didn't want her as a pilot, she would find another way to serve. There were civilian aviation companies, private security firms, and government contractors who might appreciate her skills and experience. She would not let this setback define her or destroy her dreams. But as she typed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was giving up too easily. The review board's decision wasn't just about her, it was about every pilot who had ever been judged by their appearance rather than their abilities. By accepting their verdict without further challenge, she was allowing them to set a precedent that could affect countless future aviators. Sarah stopped typing and closed the laptop. She wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself. The review board might have grounded her, but they hadn't destroyed her spirit. She would find another way to serve, another way to fly, another way to demonstrate that size didn't determine capability. The night was quiet except for the distant sound of aircraft engines and the occasional radio chatter from the control tower. Sarah lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, contemplating her next move. She had spent 8 years proving herself in the military, but perhaps it was time to prove herself in a different arena. But first, she would need to find a way to get back in the air. Because no matter what the review board had decided, no matter what regulations said about her height, Sarah Mitchell was still a pilot, and pilots were meant to fly. The emergency alarm pierced through the pre-dawn darkness at Fort Braxton like a knife through silence. Sarah jolted awake in her quarters, her military-trained reflexes instantly alert, despite having been asleep for only 3 hours. The piercing wail of the base alarm system meant only one thing: a real-world emergency. That required immediate aviation response. She rolled out of bed and reached for her flight suit, before remembering with crushing clarity that she was no longer authorized to fly. The alarm continued its urgent call as Sarah dressed quickly in her utility uniform instead of her flight gear. Through her window, she could see the flight line coming alive with activity. Ground crews were sprinting toward the helicopters, Emergency vehicles were racing across the tarmac, and the familiar organized chaos of a military aviation emergency response was unfolding. But for the first time in 8 years, she wasn't part of it. Sarah made her way toward the operations center, knowing she shouldn't be there but unable to stay away. Her new assignment didn't officially begin until Monday, which meant she was in a strange limbo where she was neither pilot nor administrator. As she approached the operations building, she could hear radio chatter crackling through speakers, urgent voices coordinating what was clearly a developing crisis. "All available aircraft to standby positions," came the voice of Major Harrison over the base public address system. "This is not a drill. All flight crews report to operations immediately." Sarah's heart raced as she recognized the tone in the Major's voice. She had heard it before during her deployment in Afghanistan, the controlled urgency that meant lives were hanging in the balance. Whatever was happening, it was serious enough to mobilize the entire aviation wing in the middle of the night. The operations center was a flurry of activity when Sarah arrived. Pilots were suiting up in their flight gear, ground crews were conducting rapid pre-flight inspections, and intelligence officers were briefing mission commanders on rapidly evolving situations. Sarah stood at the periphery, officially powerless to participate, but desperate to understand what was unfolding. Lieutenant Colonel Price spotted her across the room and made her way over, her expression grim. "Sarah, you shouldn't be here. You're not cleared for flight operations." "I know, ma'am. I just wanted to understand what's happening." "The whole base is mobilizing." Price glanced around the operations center, then spoke in a low voice. "There's been a massive accident at the Morrison chemical plant, about 40 miles southeast of here. A storage tank containing industrial chemicals has ruptured, and there's been an explosion. The local emergency services are overwhelmed, and we've been tasked with immediate search and rescue operations." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Morrison chemical plant was located in a densely populated area, surrounded by residential neighborhoods and a small elementary school. An accident there could affect thousands of people, and the mountainous terrain around the facility would make ground-based rescue operations extremely difficult. "How bad is it?" Sarah asked. "Bad. The explosion damaged the main access road, and there are reports of people trapped in a facility building that's partially collapsed. The chemical leak is creating a toxic cloud that's preventing ground crews from getting close. Aviation is the only way to get people out." As Price spoke, Sarah could see the mission assignments being distributed to the flight crews. The Apache helicopters would provide reconnaissance and security, while the Black Hawks would handle the actual evacuation operations. It was a complex, dangerous mission that would require the most skilled pilots on the base. "Mitchell!" Colonel Patterson's voice boomed across the operations center. Sarah turned to see the base commander approaching, his expression harried but determined. "What are you doing here? You're not on the flight roster." "Sir, I was just trying to understand the situation. I thought perhaps I could assist with ground operations or communications." Patterson studied her for a moment, then shook his head. "This is a flight operations emergency, Captain. You need to report to the administrative building and await further instructions." Sarah saluted and began to leave, but as she reached the door, she heard Major Harrison's voice rising above the general din. "We have a problem. Captain Rodriguez just reported mechanical failure during pre-flight. His Apache is down for maintenance, and Captain Williams called in sick with food poisoning. We're short 2 pilots for a mission that requires every available aircraft." Sarah stopped walking. She turned back toward the operations center, her heart pounding. The mission required every available Apache pilot, but the base was suddenly short 2 crews. She had more flight hours in the Apache than most of the pilots who were suiting up for the mission, more experience with complex rescue operations, and more familiarity with the terrain around Morrison Chemical Plant. "Lieutenant Colonel Price." caught her eye across the room, and Sarah could see the same thought forming in her superior's mind. Rules and regulations were important, but people's lives were more important. The review board had grounded Sarah for administrative reasons, not safety reasons. Her flying skills hadn't suddenly disappeared because of a bureaucratic decision. "Sir," Price called out to Colonel Patterson, "we need every qualified Apache pilot for this mission. Captain Mitchell has more experience with chemical plant emergencies than any other pilot on this base." Patterson's face darkened. "Colonel Price, Captain Mitchell is not cleared for flight operations." The review board's decision was final. "With respect, sir, the review board grounded her for height requirements, not flight safety. Her certifications are still current, her medical clearance is still valid, and we have people dying 40 miles from here while we debate paperwork." The operations center had fallen silent, with every pilot and crew member listening to the exchange. Sarah felt all eyes on her, the weight of expectation and scrutiny that had followed her throughout her career. But this time was different. This time, people's lives hung in the balance. Major Harrison stepped forward. "Colonel, we have confirmed reports of at least 20 people trapped in the facility's administrative building. The building is partially collapsed, there's toxic gas in the air, and ground crews can't get within a quarter mile of the structure. We need every Apache we can get airborne for reconnaissance and potential evacuation assist." Sarah took a deep breath and addressed Colonel Patterson directly. "Sir, request permission to volunteer for emergency flight operations. I understand the risks to my career, but I cannot stand by while people are trapped, and I have the skills to help save them." Patterson stared at her for a long moment, clearly wrestling with competing priorities. On one hand, he had explicit orders from the review board regarding Sarah's flight status. On the other hand, he had a humanitarian crisis unfolding and was short the pilots he needed to respond effectively. "Captain Mitchell," Patterson said finally, "if I authorize your participation in this mission, you understand that you'll be flying contrary to the review board's decision. This could end your military career permanently." "Yes, sir." "I understand. And you understand that this mission involves flying in hazardous conditions, with toxic chemicals in the air, damaged infrastructure on the ground, and potentially unstable buildings that could collapse at any moment." "Yes, sir, I understand." Patterson looked around the operations center at the faces of his pilots and crew members. These were men and women who had trained together, deployed together, and trusted each other with their lives. They were all volunteers who had chosen to serve their country, and right now their country needed them to respond to a crisis. "Captain Mitchell, you are temporarily reinstated to flight status for the duration of this emergency operation. Report to Aircraft 736 and conduct your pre-flight inspection. You'll be flying with Captain Thompson as your co-pilot." The operations center erupted in activity as the flight crews rushed to their aircraft. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline as she grabbed her flight gear and raced toward the flight line. After 3 days of being grounded, she was going back into the air, back to where she belonged. Aircraft 736 was one of the base's newer Apache helicopters, equipped with the latest avionics and weapon systems. As Sarah approached the aircraft, she could see Captain Thompson already conducting his portion of the pre-flight inspection. John Thompson was a solid pilot with 4 years of Apache experience, but he had never flown with Sarah before. "Captain Mitchell," Thompson said as she approached, "I have to ask, are you sure you're up for this? I heard about the review board decision, and I know this has to be difficult." Sarah looked at the Apache, its sleek lines and powerful engines, ready to carry them into danger. "Captain Thompson, I've been flying these aircraft for 8 years. The review board didn't take away my skills, my training, or my experience. They just took away my permission. Right now, I have that permission back, and there are people who need our help." Thompson nodded, apparently satisfied with her response. "Fair enough, Let's get this bird in the air. The pre-flight inspection went smoothly, with Sarah's muscle memory taking over as she checked every system, every component, every detail. That could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Her hands moved across the familiar controls with practiced precision, adjusting her seat to the positions she had used thousands of times before. As she settled into the pilot's seat, Sarah felt a sense of homecoming that was almost overwhelming. The Apache's cockpit was cramped and complex, filled with displays, switches, and controls that would intimidate most people. But to Sarah, it was as comfortable as her own living room. Every button and lever was exactly where she expected it to be. Every display showed information she could interpret instantly. "Pre-flight complete," Thompson reported over the intercom. "All systems green. Roger that. Engine start checklist." The twin General Electric engines wound up with their characteristic whine, building power until the entire aircraft was vibrating with barely contained energy. The rotor blades began to turn, slowly at first, then faster until they became an invisible blur above the cockpit. "Fort Braxton Tower, Apache 736 ready for takeoff," Sarah transmitted on the radio. "Apache 736, you are cleared for immediate takeoff. Proceed to Waypoint Alpha for mission briefing." "Good luck." Sarah pulled collective and felt the Apache lift off the ground. The familiar sensation of controlled flight, returning like an old friend. The helicopter rose smoothly into the pre-dawn darkness, its powerful engines carrying them toward a mission that would test every skill she had learned in 8 years of military aviation. As they climbed to cruising altitude, Sarah could see the other aircraft in their formation. 2 more Apaches were flanking them for reconnaissance, while 4 Black Hawks followed behind for evacuation operations. It was an impressive display of military aviation capability, but Sarah knew that machines alone wouldn't be enough. The success of this mission would depend on the skills and judgment of the pilots flying them. The flight to Morrison Chemical Plant took 25 minutes, and as they approached the area, Sarah could see the scope of the disaster unfolding below them. A massive plume of dark smoke was rising from the industrial facility, while smaller fires burned throughout the complex. Emergency vehicles surrounded the perimeter, their flashing lights creating a constellation of red and blue against the darkness. "Apache 736, this is Incident Command," came a voice over the radio. "We have confirmed reports of 23 people trapped in the administrative building on the north side of the complex. The building has suffered partial structural collapse, and there's a chemical leak preventing ground access." Sarah switched her display to the thermal imaging system and immediately saw the problem. The damaged chemical storage tank was venting a cloud of toxic gas that was drifting across the entire northern section of the facility. Ground crews couldn't get within 500 yards of the building without protective equipment that would take hours to deploy. "Incident Command, Apache 736. We're going to conduct a reconnaissance pass to assess the situation. Request all ground personnel maintain minimum safe distance." Sarah banked the Apache toward the north side of the complex, using the helicopter's advanced sensor systems to penetrate the smoke and chemical haze. What she saw made her heart sink. The administrative building was a 3-story structure that had been built adjacent to the chemical storage tanks. When the explosion occurred, debris had damaged the building's north wall, causing a partial collapse that blocked the main exits. "I can see heat signatures inside the building," Thompson reported, studying his display. "Looks like they're concentrated on the 2nd floor, probably in a conference room or break area." Sarah studied the tactical situation. The building was surrounded by chemical contamination that made ground approach impossible. The roof was partially damaged but still intact enough to potentially support a rescue operation. However, getting close enough to the building would require flying through the toxic cloud, something that would test the Apache's filtration systems and put the crew at significant risk. "Apache lead, "This is Apache 736, Sarah transmitted to the mission commander. "I have visual on the trapped personnel. Recommend we establish an approach corridor from the southeast to minimize exposure to chemical contamination." "Roger, 736. Begin your approach. Black Hawks will follow your lead. Once you've assessed the landing zone." Sarah pushed the Apache into a descent, heading directly toward the damaged building. As they entered the chemical cloud, warning lights began flashing on the environmental systems panel. The helicopter's filtration system was working overtime to keep toxic gases out of the cockpit, but Sarah knew they couldn't stay in this environment for very long. The building loomed ahead of them through the haze, its damaged structure presenting multiple hazards for a helicopter approach. Power lines ran along the building's east side, while debris from the explosion was scattered across the potential landing areas. The roof itself was partially collapsed, with twisted metal and concrete rubble creating an obstacle course for any aircraft trying to get close. "This is going to be tight," Thompson observed as they approached the building. "We're going to have to thread the needle between those power lines and the debris field." Sarah studied the approach carefully. The power lines were the biggest threat. High-voltage cables that could destroy the helicopter instantly if they made contact with the rotor blades. The lines ran approximately 20 feet above the building's roof, leaving very little margin for error. "Apache 736, this is Black Hawk Leader. We're standing by for your assessment of the landing zone." Sarah keyed her microphone. "Black Hawk Leader, the LZ is compromised. We have power lines 20 feet above the building and significant debris on the roof. Recommend we establish a hover pattern and use rescue hoists rather than attempting to land." "Roger that, 736. Can you establish a stable hover position for hoist operations?" Sarah looked at the tactical situation again. The chemical cloud was reducing visibility to less than 50 feet. The building was damaged and potentially unstable, and the power lines created a lethal obstacle to normal flight operations. But there were 23 people trapped inside, and the building could collapse completely at any moment. "Affirmative, Black Hawk Leader. I can establish hover position on the building's south side, but it's going to require precision flying. The margin for error is essentially zero." As Sarah maneuvered the Apache into position, she became acutely aware of every dimension of the aircraft. The helicopter was 58 feet long with a rotor diameter of 48 feet. The building was 90 feet wide, with power lines running along both the east and west sides. She would have to maintain a hover position that kept the rotor blades clear of the obstacles while remaining stable enough for the Black Hawks to conduct rescue operations. "Apache 736, you're cleared to establish hover position. Black Hawks are inbound." Sarah began her approach to the building, using every ounce of skill and experience she had accumulated over 8 years of flying. The chemical cloud made visual references difficult, so she relied heavily on the helicopter's instruments and her co-pilot's guidance. Thompson was calling out distances and obstacles, his voice steady despite the dangerous conditions. "Power lines at 2 o'clock, distance 40 feet, Thompson reported. "Debris field directly below, recommend offset to the south." Sarah made minute adjustments to the helicopter's position, fighting the turbulence created by the building's damaged structure and the heat rising from the fires below. The Apache responded to her inputs with mechanical precision, but maintaining a stable hover in these conditions required constant attention and adjustment. "Hover position established," Sarah transmitted. "LZ is clear for Black Hawk operations." The first Black Hawk appeared through the chemical haze, its pilot clearly struggling with the same visibility and turbulence issues that Sarah was fighting. The rescue helicopter moved slowly toward the building, its crew chief preparing the hoist system that would be used to extract the trapped personnel. "Apache 736, this is Rescue 1. We're going to need you to maintain exact position for the next 15 minutes while we get people out of that building. Any movement could put us into the power lines." Sarah acknowledged the transmission, knowing that 15 minutes of precision hovering in these conditions would be one of the most challenging flights of her career. The Apache was consuming fuel at a high rate due to the power required for hovering. The environmental systems were working at maximum capacity to filter out toxic gases, and the mechanical stress on the aircraft was significant. But as she watched the first rescued person being hoisted from the building's roof, Sarah felt a surge of purpose that justified every risk they were taking. These were civilians, office workers, maintenance staff, security guards who had been trapped through no fault of their own. They were depending on the skills and courage of the flight crews to get them to safety. "Victim 1 is secure," reported the Black Hawk crew chief. "Proceeding with Victim 2. The rescue operation continued with methodical precision, each person requiring several minutes to locate, secure, and hoist to safety. Sarah maintained her hover position with mechanical precision, making constant small adjustments to compensate for wind, turbulence, and the changing weight distribution. As the Black Hawk loaded and unloaded passengers, Apache 736, the advised were showing structural movement in the building. Thompson reported, monitoring his sensors. "The collapse damage is getting worse." Sarah could see what he meant on her own displays. The building's damaged north wall was showing signs of further deterioration, with debris continuing to fall from the compromised structure. If the building collapsed completely while rescue operations were in progress, it could bring down both helicopters and kill everyone involved. Rescue 1, Apache 736. The building is showing signs of further structural failure. Recommend expediting extraction operations. Roger, 736. We're working as fast as we can. Victim 12 coming up now. Sarah watched the rescue hoist operation with growing concern. They had extracted 12 people, but that left 11 still trapped inside the deteriorating building. The chemical cloud was getting thicker, reducing visibility even further, and the Apache's environmental systems were beginning to show signs of strain. Apache 736, this is Apache lead. What's your fuel status? Sarah checked her gauges. Apache lead, we're at 40% fuel remaining. Estimate 10 more minutes of hover time before we need to return to base. Roger that. Black Hawks report they need at least 15 more minutes to extract all personnel. The mathematics of the situation were grim. Sarah could maintain her position for 10 more minutes, but the rescue operation needed 15. That left a 5-minute gap where either the Apache would have to leave the scene, potentially causing the rescue operation to fail, or they would have to continue hovering until their fuel ran critically low. Apache lead, request permission to continue hover operations beyond recommended fuel reserves. There was a long pause before Apache lead responded. Apache 736, that would put you below emergency fuel levels. If you develop mechanical problems, you might not make it back to base. Sarah looked at the building below, where 11 people were still trapped in a structure that could collapse at any moment. She thought about the review board that had grounded her 3 days earlier, the bureaucrats who had decided she wasn't qualified to fly because of her height. None of them were here now. None of them were facing the decision between following regulations and saving lives. Apache lead, I'm staying on station until all personnel are extracted. These people aren't trapped because of paperwork, and they're not going to die because I was worried about fuel regulations. Thompson looked at her across the cockpit. Captain, if we run low on fuel in this chemical cloud, we might not be able to auto-rotate safely. The visibility is too poor for an emergency landing. Sarah understood the risks better than anyone. Emergency auto-rotation required visual references that simply weren't available in the toxic haze surrounding the building. If the engines failed, they would likely crash before they could find a safe landing area. But 11 people were depending on them to maintain their position, and she wasn't going to abandon them because of statistical probabilities. Captain Thompson, I need you to be clear on something. I'm going to maintain this hover position until every person is out of that building, regardless of fuel state. If you're not comfortable with that decision, I'll understand if you want to transfer to another aircraft. Thompson was quiet for a moment, then keyed his microphone. Captain Mitchell, I've been flying with the Army for 4 years, and I've never seen anyone maintain a hover position in conditions like this. If you think we can stay here and save these people, then that's what we're going to do. The rescue operation continued with increasing urgency as both fuel and time ran short. Sarah could feel the Apache responding more sluggishly as the fuel load decreased, requiring more power to maintain the same performance. The environmental systems were showing warnings about filter saturation, and the chemical sensors were detecting increasingly dangerous levels of contamination outside the aircraft. Victim 18 secure, reported the Black Hawk crew chief. 5 more to go. Sarah checked her fuel gauges again. They were now at 25%, well below the minimum reserve required for safe return to base. If they continued for 5 more minutes, they would be operating in the emergency zone where engine failure or mechanical problems could prove fatal. Apache 736, this is Incident Command. We're showing dangerous readings on our chemical sensors. The leak is getting worse, and the contamination levels are approaching lethal concentrations. Sarah acknowledged the transmission, but didn't alter her position. The chemical threat was real, but it was a known risk that they had accepted when they began the mission. The trapped personnel didn't have the protection of filtered air systems and pressurized cockpits. Every minute they remained in the building increased their chances of chemical poisoning or structural collapse. Victim 20 extracted, came the report from the Black Hawk. 3 more to go. The building shuddered visibly as another section of the damaged north wall gave way, sending debris cascading toward the ground. Sarah had to adjust her position to avoid the falling concrete, a maneuver that brought the Apache's rotor blades within 10 feet of the power lines. Careful, Captain, Thompson warned. We're getting close to the wires. Sarah made a minute adjustment to increase their clearance, but she knew they were operating in an increasingly narrow margin of safety. The building was deteriorating, the chemical contamination was getting worse, their fuel was running low, and the rescue operation was taking longer than anticipated. Apache 736, this is Apache Lead. I'm ordering you to return to base immediately. Your fuel state is becoming critical. Sarah looked at the building below where 3 people were, still trapped in a structure that could collapse at any moment. She thought about her career, her future, her obligations to follow orders and maintain discipline. Then she thought about 3 human beings who were depending on her to stay in position for 3 more minutes. Apache Lead, negative. I'm staying on station until extraction is complete. Captain Mitchell, that's a direct order. Return to base immediately. Sarah switched off her radio transmitter, cutting communication with the mission commander. She knew it was career suicide, knew she was violating every principle of military discipline and chain of command. But sometimes the right decision wasn't the safe decision, and sometimes saving lives required breaking rules. Victim 21 secure, reported the Black Hawk crew chief. 2 more to go. The Apache's low fuel warning light was now illuminated, indicating that they had passed into the emergency reserve zone. If they lost an engine now, they would have very little time to find a safe landing area before the remaining engine ran out of fuel. But Sarah held her position, maintaining the precise hover that allowed the Black Hawk to continue its rescue operations. Final victim coming up now, the crew chief reported. This is the last one. Sarah felt a surge of relief as she watched the 23rd person being hoisted from the building's roof. 23 lives saved because a helicopter crew was willing to risk everything to maintain a hover position in impossible conditions. It was the kind of mission that justified every hour of training, every personal sacrifice, every challenge she had overcome in her aviation career. All personnel extracted, the Black Hawk pilot reported, departing the area immediately. Sarah finally allowed herself to relax slightly as she watched the rescue helicopter disappear into the chemical haze, carrying the last of the trapped personnel to safety. The building below was empty now, no longer a tomb for innocent people, but simply another piece of damaged infrastructure that could be repaired or demolished as necessary. Apache 736, this is Apache lead. What is your fuel state? Sarah switched her transmitter back on. Apache lead, we're at 15% fuel remaining. Departing the area now. The flight back to Fort Braxton was tense, with Sarah carefully managing the Apache's remaining fuel while monitoring the aircraft systems for any signs of contamination damage. The environmental filters would need to be replaced. The engines would require inspection for chemical exposure, and the entire aircraft would need decontamination before it could return to service. But they had accomplished the mission. 23 people were alive because a flight crew had been willing to push their aircraft and themselves beyond normal limits. It was the kind of success that couldn't be measured in regulations or performance metrics, only in human lives saved. As they approached Fort Braxton, Sarah could see emergency vehicles waiting on the flight line. The base medical team was standing by to examine the crew for chemical exposure, while maintenance personnel were prepared to begin immediate decontamination procedures on the aircraft. Fort Braxton Tower, Apache 736 requesting immediate landing. We have possible chemical contamination and are low on fuel. Apache 736, you are cleared for immediate landing on Pad 3. Emergency crews are standing by. Sarah brought the Apache down in a perfect landing, the helicopter settling onto the concrete pad with barely a vibration. As the engines wound down, she began the shutdown checklist with the same methodical precision she had used throughout the mission. Captain Mitchell, Thompson said as they completed the post-flight procedures, I want you to know that was some of the finest flying I've ever witnessed. What you did back there saved 23 lives. Sarah looked across the cockpit at her co-pilot, a man who had trusted her judgment and skill even when it meant risking his own life. Thank you, Captain Thompson. It was an honor to fly with you. As they climbed out of the cockpit, Sarah could see Colonel Patterson approaching across the flight line, his expression unreadable. Behind him walked several other senior officers, including the members of the review board that had grounded her just 3 days earlier. Sarah knew that her decision to disobey a direct order and continue the mission beyond safe fuel limits would have serious consequences. She had violated military discipline, ignored chain of command, and put both herself and her co-pilot at risk. The fact that the mission had been successful wouldn't necessarily protect her from the disciplinary action that was sure to follow. But as she looked back at the Apache that had carried them through one of the most challenging missions of her career, Sarah felt no regret. Sometimes being a pilot meant more than following procedures and obeying regulations. Sometimes it meant making the hard choice between safety and service, between personal consequences and saving lives. The review board had grounded her because they didn't think she was qualified to fly the Apache. Tonight, she had proven that qualification couldn't be measured in inches or regulations, only in skill, courage, and the willingness to risk everything. When lives hung in the balance, Colonel Patterson reached her position and stopped, studying her face for any sign of doubt or uncertainty. Captain Mitchell, you disobeyed a direct order from your mission commander. Yes, sir, I did. You operated your aircraft beyond safe fuel limits in hazardous conditions. Yes, sir. You violated several safety regulations and put both yourself and your co-pilot at unnecessary risk. Sarah stood at attention, knowing that her military career was probably over, but feeling no shame for the choices she had made. Yes, sir. And 23 people went home to their families tonight because of those decisions. Patterson stared at her for a long moment, then turned to look at the Apache behind her. The helicopter showed signs of its ordeal: scorch marks from the chemical exposure, metal fatigue from the extended hover operations, and the general wear that came from pushing a machine beyond its normal limits. "Captain Mitchell," Patterson said finally, "report to my office at 0800 hours tomorrow morning. We need to discuss your future with this command." As the colonel walked away, Sarah felt the weight of uncertainty settling over her once again. She had saved 23 lives, but she might have destroyed her own career in the process. The review board that had grounded her for being too short would now have to deal with a pilot who had proven that size had nothing to do with capability, that heart and skill mattered more than regulations and physical specifications. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, 23 people were alive because a pilot named Sarah Mitchell had been willing to risk everything to keep a helicopter in position for 15 crucial minutes. And sometimes that was enough. The medical decontamination process took 3 hours. Sarah sat in the base hospital while technicians checked her blood for chemical exposure and doctors examined her for any signs of poisoning from the toxic cloud. The tests came back clean. The Apache's environmental systems had protected both her and Captain Thompson from the worst effects of the contamination. At 0800 hours sharp, Sarah stood outside Colonel Patterson's office in her dress uniform, the fabric crisp and every detail perfect. She had spent the early morning hours preparing for what she assumed would be a disciplinary hearing that could end her military career. Disobeying direct orders during a mission was grounds for court-martial, regardless of the outcome. "Enter," came Patterson's voice from behind the door. Sarah stepped into the office to find not just Colonel Patterson, but the entire review board that had grounded her, along with Lieutenant Colonel Price and Major Harrison. The room felt smaller with so many senior officers present, their expressions ranging from stern to curious. "Captain Mitchell, please be seated," Patterson said, gesturing to a chair facing his desk. Sarah remained standing. "Sir, I prefer to stand." Patterson nodded. "Very well. Captain, last night you violated several direct orders, operated your aircraft in conditions that exceeded safety parameters, and put both yourself and your co-pilot at significant risk. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" "No, sir. I accept full responsibility for my actions." Colonel Richardson, the visiting board member who had been most critical during her review, leaned forward. "Captain Mitchell, help me understand your decision-making process. You were given a direct order to return to base due to low fuel, and you chose to disobey that order. Why?" Sarah looked around the room at the faces of the officers who would determine her fate. These were career military men who had built their lives around discipline, order, and following the chain of command. What she had done violated everything they believed about military structure. "Sir, there were still 3 people trapped in that building. If I had left my position, the rescue operation would have failed and those people would have died. I made a judgment call that saving 3 lives was worth the risk to 1 aircraft and 2 crew members. But you put your co-pilot's life at risk without his consent," Richardson continued. "You made a unilateral decision that could have killed Captain Thompson." "Actually, sir, Captain Thompson was informed of the risks and chose to remain on the mission. He could have requested transfer to another aircraft, but he elected to stay." Major Harrison spoke up. "Captain Mitchell, what would you have done if your aircraft had suffered engine failure while you were hovering in that chemical cloud? The visibility was too poor for safe auto-rotation, and you were beyond gliding distance of any suitable landing area." Sarah had thought about this scenario extensively during the night. "Sir, we would have attempted auto-rotation to the clearest area available and hoped for the best. But engine failure was a possibility, not a certainty. The death of those 3 people was a certainty if we abandoned our position. Colonel Patterson opened a folder on his desk. Captain Mitchell, I've received some interesting reports about your mission performance. The incident commander at Morrison Chemical Plant has submitted a formal commendation for your actions. He states that your precision flying in impossible conditions saved 23 lives. Sarah felt a flicker of surprise, but maintained her composure. Thank you, sir. I've also received a report from Captain Thompson detailing your performance. During the mission, he describes your flying as exceptional and states that he has never seen anyone maintain such precise aircraft control under those conditions. Patterson continued reading from the file. The rescue crews report that your hover position was so stable they were able to conduct hoist operations as if they were in perfect weather conditions. The Black Hawk pilots state that without your precision flying, the rescue operation would have been impossible. Colonel Richardson interrupted. Colonel Patterson, while Captain Mitchell's flying may have been impressive, the fact remains that she violated direct orders and exceeded safety parameters. We cannot ignore military discipline simply because the outcome was favorable. You're absolutely right, Colonel Richardson, Patterson replied. Military discipline is essential to our operations. However, we also have to consider the broader implications of our decisions. Patterson stood and walked to the window overlooking the flight line. Gentlemen, 3 days ago this board grounded Captain Mitchell because of concerns about her physical qualifications. We determined that her height made her unsuitable for Apache operations. Last night, that same pilot saved 23 lives in conditions that would have challenged our most experienced aviators. Lieutenant Colonel Price added, Sir, I think we need to examine what qualifications really matter for pilot effectiveness. Captain Mitchell has demonstrated that skill, judgment, and courage are more important than physical specifications. Colonel Richardson's expression remained stern. Colonel Price, regulations exist for good reasons. If we start making exceptions based on individual performance, we undermine the entire system of standards and requirements. With respect, sir, Sarah interjected, the regulations also state that the primary mission of military aviation is to serve and protect. Last night, I served that mission to the best of my ability. If following regulations had meant letting people die, then perhaps the regulations need to be reconsidered. The room fell silent. Sarah knew she had crossed a line by directly challenging military regulations, but she also knew this might be her only opportunity to speak her mind before being disciplined or discharged. Major Harrison broke the silence. Captain Mitchell, you understand that your actions last night, while heroic, also demonstrated a willingness to disregard authority when you disagree with orders. Sir, I would never disregard authority for personal reasons or convenience. But when human lives are at stake and I have the capability to save them, I believe that takes precedence over procedural concerns. Colonel Patterson returned to his desk and opened another file. Captain Mitchell, I want to read you something. This is from the Army Aviation Command's official report on the Morrison Chemical Plant rescue operation. He cleared his throat and began reading. The successful extraction of 23 civilians from a structurally compromised building in hazardous environmental conditions required exceptional piloting skill and judgment. Captain Sarah Mitchell's ability to maintain a precise hover position for 15 minutes in near-zero visibility conditions, while avoiding multiple obstacles and managing critical fuel levels, represents the highest standards of military aviation. Excellence. Patterson looked up from the report. The Army Aviation Command has recommended you for the Distinguished Flying Cross for your actions during this mission. Sarah felt the world shift around her. The Distinguished Flying Cross was one of the military's highest honors for aviation achievement, awarded only for extraordinary heroism in flight. 3 days ago, she had been grounded for being too short. Now she was being recommended for one of the most prestigious medals in military aviation. Furthermore, Patterson continued, the Aviation Command has requested a full review of the physical standards used to evaluate pilot qualifications. Your performance during the rescue operation has raised questions about whether current height requirements are relevant to actual flying capability. Colonel Richardson looked uncomfortable. Colonel Patterson, are you suggesting that this board's decision was incorrect? I'm suggesting that our decision was based on incomplete information. We focused on physical specifications rather than operational capability. Captain Mitchell has demonstrated that her height has no impact on her ability to fly the Apache helicopter at the highest level. Lieutenant Colonel Price added, Sir, I think we also need to consider the message we send to other pilots. If we ground our most capable aviators for arbitrary physical reasons, we're telling the entire aviation community that politics matter more than performance. Sarah remained at attention while the officers debated her fate, but she could sense that the mood in the room had shifted. The rescue mission had changed the context of her case from a discussion about regulations to a demonstration of capability. Colonel Patterson looked directly at Sarah. Captain Mitchell, this board has 3 options. We can uphold our original decision and transfer you to a non-flying position. We can court-martial you for disobeying orders during the rescue mission. Or we can acknowledge that our original assessment was flawed and reinstate you to full flight. Status. What is your recommendation, sir? My recommendation is that you return to flight status immediately. You have proven beyond any doubt that you are not only qualified to fly the Apache, but that you are one of the most skilled pilots in this command. Colonel Richardson shook his head. Colonel Patterson, I cannot support reinstating a pilot who has demonstrated a willingness to disobey direct orders. Military discipline requires consequences for insubordination. Major Harrison spoke up. Sir, with respect, Captain Mitchell didn't disobey orders out of insubordination. She made a tactical decision based on the situation on the ground. That's exactly the kind of judgment we want in our combat pilots. The debate continued for several more minutes, with the board members weighing military discipline against operational effectiveness, regulations against results. Sarah stood silently, knowing that her future hung in the balance of this discussion. Finally, Colonel Patterson called for a vote. All those in favor of reinstating Captain Mitchell to full flight status? 4 hands went up, including Patterson's. Only Colonel Richardson voted against reinstatement. Captain Mitchell, Patterson announced, you are hereby reinstated to full flight status. Your temporary grounding is rescinded, and you will return to your regular duties effective immediately. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she maintained her military bearing. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. Captain, I also want you to know that the modifications to your aircraft are no longer considered problematic. If you need seat adjustments to fly effectively, then that's what we'll provide. Our job is to put the best pilots in the air, not to enforce arbitrary standards that have no bearing on performance. As the meeting concluded and the officers began to file out of the room, Colonel Richardson approached Sarah. His expression was still stern, but there was a hint of respect in his eyes. Captain Mitchell, I still believe you violated military discipline last night, but I also recognize that you saved 23 lives through exceptional flying skill. I hope you understand that our concerns about standards aren't personal, they're about maintaining consistency across the entire aviation community. I understand, sir. And I hope you understand that my actions weren't about disrespecting authority. They were about fulfilling our mission to serve and protect. Richardson nodded and left the room, leaving Sarah alone with Colonel Patterson. Captain, Patterson said, I want you to know that what happened here goes beyond just your individual case. The Army is reviewing pilot qualification standards across all aircraft platforms. Your performance during the rescue mission has demonstrated That we need to focus on capability rather than physical specifications. Sarah finally allowed herself to relax slightly. Sir, does this mean other pilots won't face the same challenges I've experienced? It means we're going to evaluate pilots based on their ability to do the job, not on how they look or how tall they are. You've opened a door that needed to be opened. As Sarah left Colonel Patterson's office, she felt a sense of vindication that went beyond personal satisfaction. The jokes about her height would probably continue, the skeptical looks from maintenance crews would likely persist, but none of that mattered anymore. She had proven that capability couldn't be measured in inches, that skill was more important than specifications, and that sometimes the person who looked least qualified was actually the most qualified of all. The flight line was busy with morning operations as Sarah walked toward the hangar. Apache helicopters were being prepared for training missions, and she could see her fellow pilots conducting their pre-flight inspections. Several of them nodded in her direction, offering smiles and thumbs-up gestures that hadn't been there before the rescue mission. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was working on one of the Apaches when Sarah approached. The man who had joked about her needing a booster seat just days earlier now looked genuinely respectful. "Captain Mitchell," he said, "I want to apologize for the comments I made before. What you did at Morrison was incredible. I've been working on these aircraft for 15 years, and I've never seen flying like that. Thank you, Sergeant." Number. Apology necessary. We're all on the same team here. Rodriguez nodded. "Ma'am, I want you to know that your aircraft is ready for whatever mission comes next. We've replaced the environmental filters, inspected the engines, and everything checks out perfectly." Sarah looked at the Apache, the machine that had carried her through one of the most challenging missions of her career. The helicopter looked exactly the same as before, but somehow it seemed different, now not just a piece of military equipment, but a partner that had helped her save 23 lives. "Sergeant Rodriguez, make sure that aircraft is always ready. You never know when someone's life might depend on it." As Sarah walked across the hangar, she noticed that the conversations around her had changed. Instead of jokes about her height, she heard discussions about flying techniques, mission procedures, and aircraft capabilities. The maintenance crews were treating her with the same respect they showed to any other pilot, judging her by her performance rather than her appearance. 3 months later, Captain Sarah Mitchell was promoted to Major and assigned as the squadron's chief flight instructor. Her job was to train the next generation of Apache pilots, teaching them not just the technical aspects of flying, but the judgment and courage required to make life-and-death decisions under pressure. The physical standards for pilot qualification were officially revised, focusing on demonstrated capability rather than arbitrary measurements. The changes affected not just height requirements, but numerous other specifications that had prevented qualified candidates from pursuing aviation careers. Sarah's story became part of the curriculum at the Army Aviation School, studied by future pilots as an example of how skill and determination could overcome prejudice and bureaucracy. The lesson wasn't just about aviation, it was about the danger of judging people by their appearance rather than their abilities. The Distinguished Flying Cross ceremony took place on a bright autumn day, with Sarah's parents in attendance to watch their daughter receive one of the military's highest honors. As the medal was pinned to her uniform, Sarah thought about all the challenges she had overcome, all the doubts she had faced, and all the people who had underestimated her because of her size. But she also thought about the 23 people who went home to their families because a pilot named Sarah Mitchell had been willing to risk everything to keep a helicopter in position for 15 crucial minutes. And in the end, that was what mattered most, not the height of the pilot, but the height of their courage and the depth of their commitment to serving others. The ceremony concluded with a flyover by a formation of Apache helicopters, their distinctive silhouettes cutting across the clear sky. Sarah watched them pass overhead and smiled, knowing that somewhere in those cockpits were pilots who would never be judged by their physical appearance rather than their flying ability. The quiet person in the corner had built more than just a career. She had built a legacy of proving that true qualification comes from the heart, not from a measuring tape. 5 years after the Morrison chemical plant rescue, Major Sarah Mitchell stood in the briefing room at Fort Campbell, addressing a class of newly graduated Apache pilots. The young aviators sat at attention, their fresh uniforms and eager expressions reminding her of her own early days in military aviation. Among them were 3 women, 2 Hispanic pilots, and 1 young man who couldn't have been much taller than Sarah herself. Today we're going to discuss operational decision-making under pressure. Sarah began, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of combat experience and leadership. In military aviation, you'll face situations where the book doesn't have answers, where regulations conflict with reality, and where you'll have to make choices that could save lives or cost them. One of the female pilots raised her hand. "Ma'am, how do you know when to break protocol? How do you distinguish between necessary risks and reckless endangerment?" Sarah smiled, recognizing the same question she had asked herself throughout her career. That's the fundamental challenge every pilot faces. The difference between courage and stupidity is often measured in preparation, skill, and judgment. You break protocol when following it would result in a worse outcome than violating it. She moved to the tactical display screen and pulled up a satellite image of Morrison Chemical Plant, now rebuilt and operational with enhanced safety systems. The young pilots leaned forward, sensing that this wasn't just another training scenario. 5 years ago, I was grounded by a review board that determined I was physically unqualified to fly the Apache helicopter. 3 days later, I violated direct orders to save 23 civilian lives during a chemical plant disaster. Both of those events taught me something important about what it really means to be a military pilot. The room was completely silent. Some of the pilots had heard rumors about Major Mitchell's unconventional path to squadron leadership, but few knew the details of her story. Being grounded taught me that other people's opinions about your capabilities don't define what you can actually accomplish. The rescue mission taught me that sometimes doing your job means ignoring the people who tell you how to do your job. The young Hispanic pilot spoke up. "Ma'am, weren't you concerned about ending your career, court-martial proceedings, losing everything you'd worked for?" Sarah nodded. "Absolutely. I knew that disobeying orders could destroy my military career. But I also knew that 23 people would die if I followed those orders. When you're faced with that choice, career considerations become secondary." She clicked to the next slide, showing performance statistics from the rescue operation. Flight times, fuel consumption, precision measurements of the hover position she had maintained in impossible conditions. The Apache helicopter weighs 17,000 pounds and has a rotor span of 48 feet. Maintaining a stable hover position in toxic chemical clouds, with zero visibility next to power lines for 15 minutes straight, requires every skill you've learned and some you haven't learned yet. But the technical challenge wasn't what made the mission difficult. Sarah paused, looking around the room at the young faces watching her intently. The difficult part was accepting that everyone around me expected me to fail. My height had been a source of jokes and doubt for 8 years. When I was grounded, many people saw it as inevitable. When I volunteered for the rescue mission, some thought I was trying to prove a point rather than save lives. The shortest pilot in the class, a young man named Lieutenant Davis, raised his hand. "Ma'am, how did you deal with the constant skepticism? How did you maintain confidence when everyone around you expressed doubt?" Sarah recognized something of herself in the young lieutenant's question. The skepticism never goes away completely. Even today, I occasionally hear comments about my size or see looks of surprise when people learn I'm a squadron commander. But I've learned that proving yourself isn't a one-time event. It's an ongoing process. She clicked to a photograph, showing her receiving the Distinguished Flying Cross, flanked by her parents and Colonel Patterson. The ceremony had taken place on a perfect autumn day, with a formation flyover and full military honors. This medal represents official recognition of my flying abilities, but it didn't change who I am or what I'm capable of. I was the same pilot before the ceremony as I was after it. The difference was that other people finally acknowledged what had always been true. One of the female pilots asked, "Ma'am, did receiving the medal eliminate the discrimination you faced? Did people stop making assumptions about your capabilities?" Sarah laughed, a sound that carried both amusement and resignation. "Last month, I walked into a maintenance hangar wearing civilian clothes to check on aircraft repairs. A new mechanic told me the base tour was scheduled for later in the afternoon and asked if I was lost. When I explained that I was the squadron commander, he asked to see my identification." The young pilots exchanged glances, understanding the implications of what she was describing. The point isn't that discrimination disappears when you prove yourself. The point is that proving yourself changes the conversation. Instead of arguing about whether you belong, you're arguing about how to do the job better. Sarah moved to the final slide, showing current recruitment statistics for Army aviation. The numbers told a story of increasing diversity, with more women and minorities entering pilot training than ever before. The Morrison rescue mission accomplished more than saving 23 lives. It forced the Army to examine its pilot qualification standards and recognize that capability can't be measured by physical specifications alone. The height requirements that would have ended my career have been revised, and dozens of qualified pilots who would have been rejected are now flying combat missions. Lieutenant Davis raised his hand again. "Ma'am, what advice would you give to pilots who face similar challenges? How do you recommend dealing with discrimination or doubt?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "First, be better than everyone else. Not just as good, better. When people are looking for reasons to dismiss you, exceptional performance becomes your strongest argument. Second, focus on the mission, not the politics. The people you're serving don't care about your height or gender or background. They care about whether you can do the job when they need you." She paused, thinking about her own journey from ridiculed cadet to decorated squadron commander. Third, understand that changing minds is a long-term project. You won't convince everyone, and you shouldn't try. Focus on convincing the people who matter: your teammates, your commanders, and most importantly, yourself. The briefing concluded with questions about tactical procedures and emergency protocols, but Sarah could see that the real lesson had already been absorbed. These young pilots understood that military aviation was about more than flying helicopters. It was about proving that excellence transcended expectations. After the class dismissed, Lieutenant Davis approached Sarah's desk. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for sharing your story. I faced some of the same challenges you described, and it helps to know that someone else has overcome them." Sarah looked at the young pilot, seeing in him the same determination she had carried throughout her own career. "Lieutenant, the most important thing you can do is fly so well that your height becomes irrelevant. Make them judge you by your performance, not your appearance." "Yes, ma'am, I understand." As Davis left the briefing room, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since her own early days as a pilot. The jokes and skepticism hadn't disappeared entirely, but they had become less frequent and less tolerated. The military was slowly learning to value capability over conformity, results over regulations. That evening, Sarah received a call from Colonel Patterson, now a brigadier general, commanding an aviation brigade in Korea. Their relationship had evolved from commander and subordinate to colleagues and friends, built on mutual respect and shared understanding of what military leadership required. "Sarah, I wanted to call and congratulate you on your promotion to lieutenant colonel." The selection board was unanimous in their recommendation. Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction. Lieutenant colonel represented a significant milestone in her career, a rank that would give her command authority over multiple squadrons and hundreds of personnel. Thank you, sir. I'm honored by the selection. You've earned it. More importantly, you've changed how this institution thinks about pilot qualifications. The young aviators coming through training today have opportunities that didn't exist 5 years ago, largely because of what you accomplished. After the call ended, Sarah walked out to the flight line where the squadron's Apache helicopters were parked in neat rows. The familiar silhouettes looked unchanged from her early days as a pilot, but she knew that the aircraft represented something different now. They were no longer machines reserved for pilots who met arbitrary physical standards, but tools available to anyone with the skill and courage to fly them effectively. A young maintenance sergeant approached her as she conducted an informal inspection of the aircraft. "Ma'am, I wanted to let you know that aircraft 847 is ready for tomorrow's training mission. We've completed all the scheduled maintenance and she's performing perfectly." Sarah nodded her appreciation. "Thank you, Sergeant Williams. How are the new pilots adapting to their aircraft assignments?" "Very well, ma'am. Lieutenant Davis has been particularly impressive. His aircraft handling is already at the level of pilots with twice his experience." As Sarah walked back toward the operations building, she thought about the young lieutenant and the challenges he would face throughout his career. The path wouldn't be easy. It never was for pilots who didn't fit the traditional mold. But he would have advantages that she hadn't enjoyed. A military culture that was gradually becoming more accepting of diversity. Qualification standards based on performance rather than appearance, and the knowledge that others had succeeded despite similar obstacles. The following morning brought news that would test everything Sarah had learned about leadership and judgment. A massive earthquake had struck the Philippines, causing widespread destruction and trapping thousands of people in collapsed buildings. The U.S. military was organizing a humanitarian relief operation, and experienced Apache pilots were needed for search and rescue missions in mountainous terrain. Sarah volunteered immediately, knowing that the mission would require the kind of precision flying and split-second decision-making that had defined her career. The terrain would be challenging, the weather conditions unpredictable, and the stakes measured in human lives rather than training scores. Lieutenant Davis also volunteered for the mission, eager to apply his training in a real-world scenario. Sarah approved his participation, recognizing that combat experience was essential for developing the judgment that separated good pilots from great ones. The flight to the Philippines took 18 hours, with multiple refueling stops and crew changes. As their transport aircraft approached the disaster zone, Sarah could see the scope of the destruction below. Entire mountainside communities had been destroyed by landslides, coastal areas had been inundated by tsunamis, and the infrastructure needed for ground-based rescue operations had been completely destroyed. The Apache helicopters were among the few aircraft capable of operating in the mountainous terrain where many survivors were trapped. Their advanced sensor systems could detect heat signatures through debris. Their precision flying capabilities allowed access to areas impossible for larger aircraft, and their durability provided the safety margin needed for dangerous rescue operations. Sarah's first mission involved searching for survivors in a remote village that had been cut off by landslides. Flying at low altitude through mountain valleys, using thermal imaging to scan for signs of life, required the same combination of technical skill and intuitive judgment that had characterized her entire career. "Contact," Lieutenant Davis called from the aircraft flying alongside hers. "I'm showing multiple heat signatures in the debris field at grid coordinates 847 to 392. Sarah switched her display to the same coordinates and confirmed the readings. 7 people were trapped in what had once been a school building, now buried under tons of rock and concrete. The only way to reach them would be to land in a clearing barely large enough for one helicopter, with unstable terrain that could shift at any moment. Davis, I'll establish the landing zone. You provide overwatch and be prepared to extract us if the ground gives way. The landing was one of the most challenging of Sarah's career, requiring millimeter precision to avoid the debris field while setting down on ground that shifted under the helicopter's weight. But her years of experience had prepared her for exactly this kind of situation, and the Apache touched down as gently as a feather. The rescue operation took 4 hours, with Sarah's crew working alongside Filipino emergency responders to extract 7 survivors from the collapsed building. Each person had to be carefully moved through unstable debris, requiring the kind of patience and precision that couldn't be taught in training scenarios. As they lifted off with the rescued survivors, Sarah felt the same sense of purpose that had driven her throughout her career. This was why she had endured the jokes, overcome the bureaucracy, and fought for the right to fly. Not for personal glory or professional advancement, but for moments like this when her skills could make the difference between life and death. The relief operation continued for 2 weeks, with Sarah's squadron conducting dozens of rescue missions. Throughout the disaster zone, Lieutenant Davis proved himself repeatedly, demonstrating the same combination of skill and courage that Sarah had shown during her own early challenges. On their final day in the Philippines, Sarah received a message from the local incident commander expressing gratitude for her squadron's performance. 43 lives had been saved through their precision flying in impossible conditions, continuing a tradition of excellence that had begun 5 years earlier at a chemical plant in Alabama. The flight home gave Sarah time to reflect on how her career had evolved from personal struggle to institutional change. She was no longer fighting to prove her own capabilities, but working to ensure that future pilots would be judged by their performance rather than their appearance. As their aircraft approached Fort Campbell, Sarah could see the familiar outline of the flight line where her journey had begun. The Apache helicopters parked below looked the same as they had years earlier, but she knew that the opportunities they represented had expanded far beyond what anyone had imagined. Lieutenant Davis would go on to become one of the Army's most skilled pilots, eventually commanding his own squadron and mentoring the next generation of aviators who didn't fit traditional molds. The precedent set by Sarah's career had created space for excellence to flourish regardless of physical specifications. But the real measure of Sarah's impact wasn't in the awards she had received or the positions she had achieved. It was in the young pilots who would never face the same barriers she had encountered, the rescue missions that would be flown by pilots who might have been rejected under the old standards, and the lives that would be saved by people whose capabilities couldn't be measured in inches. Sometimes the most important victories weren't the ones that made headlines, but the ones that opened doors for others to walk through. And sometimes the person who looked least qualified turned out to be exactly the person needed to redefine what qualification really meant. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.